Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for turning up. It's wonderful to see a full room in Washington, D.C. in the middle of summer and the NATO summit and all sorts of other things going on. But we are pleased to have you here. My name is Sandra Pepra, and I'm the Director for Gender, Women and Democracy at the National Democratic Institute. Lots of good friends in the room, and it's been a wonderful reunion, even in the green room. So without further ado, I am going to hand over for welcome remarks from our leadership of both NDI and Carnegie. So pleased to come up, Tino Cuellar and Harriet Babbitt, both of whom are our luminaries. Tino, of course, runs Carnegie all by himself. And is well known to most people. And then Ambassador Harriet Babbitt is the vice chair of NDI's board, and she will follow Tino. But first of all, Tino.
Thank you so much. And if anybody runs Carnegie, it's not me. It's a stellar team of women and men around me, which is a real privilege to work with. By the way, this is a great turnout. The last time, in fact, actually, I will say, when Jake Sullivan was here, the room didn't even fill up this much. I'm just saying. So, Women Lead. I'm delighted to play a small role in helping to launch this with my colleagues at NDI and my colleagues at Carnegie, and with all the partners that we've had the chance to talk to in the green room and around this room. What is our mission, and why does it relate to the goals of Women Lead? We use research, we use ideas, we use relationships to promote an enduring and meaningful peace. One that's informed by pragmatism as well as principle, one that allows people all over the world to live better lives. Our work stretches over more than a century at Carnegie, since we were founded by Andrew Carnegie in 1910. And what we've seen over and over again, decade after decade, is that an enduring peace, a sustainable peace, is about more than the absence of war. It's about cooperation, it's about institutions that allow billions to enjoy greater prosperity and countries to meet the needs of their people. In the course of all that time, I think it's fair to say that it's become painfully clear to us that there is no way to move the world in the direction of a more lasting peace without full opportunity for civic and political participation from everyone. What is clear today, as well, is that this is a crucial moment for democracy. More than 1 billion people around the world have already voted. By year's end, more than 60 countries with almost half the world's population are expected to have had national elections. But all of us in this room know that elections don't tell the whole story. Just about any democracy today, no matter what corner of the world you hail from, is facing serious challenges. Distrust of institutions, polarization, difficulties delivering good governance, attacks by extremist actors. These are challenges that intensify when people go to the polls, but they endure beyond election cycles. These are the sorts of challenges that fray social bonds, that tear people apart. The idea, for example, that social change has gone too far. The traditional hierarchies should be reinforced rather than questioned. That strong relationships that exist, sadly, between these sorts of ideas, questioning change, and all what ails democracy are not an accident. Expanding women's rights, women's opportunity to participate in civic space over the past century has been closely connected to the broader fight for democracy, for principles of equality, and for principles of human dignity. All of which means to us here at Carnegie, as we do our work day in, day out, that it matters to make sure that women can play a meaningful role in our civic life, in our political life, in our social life, in promoting the world's peace and security. Gender equality is about making the world achieve everything that it can. Women around the world are on the front lines in the fight for democracy and the kind of governance that can make the world more cooperative. Look at Brazil, Poland, Belarus, Myanmar, Iran, India, Sudan, and even here in the United States. Women have mobilized in vast numbers against leaders and policies that threaten rights and democratic freedoms. Protecting democracy globally requires us, therefore, to invest in women as agents of change. Women comprise just over a quarter of parliamentarians in single or lower houses globally, some of them in this room. That figure has increased from 11% in 1995, but is far short of where we'd like to be. Of cabinet members and leading ministries, women represent little more than just 23%, and men continue to dominate leadership of economic and defense portfolios. Take the world's experience and common sense together, and it becomes even clearer that this all is interconnected at the end of the day. We need all the talent, wisdom, and life experience that will come from having women fully represented at the highest levels of civic decision-making. Whether the issue is artificial intelligence or climate change or migration or defense, massive social changes affect different groups in unique ways, and effective solutions depend on understanding our world as it is, not just as we'd like it to be. No one is served by serious digital abuse targeting women or by digital spaces that completely ignore the value of promoting inclusion or safety for all participants, or by ignoring the factors closing civic spaces to full participation from women. At Carnegie, we work to understand what it takes to protect civic space in ways that affect international cooperation and ultimately peace. We conduct rigorous analyses, maintain relationships, striving to shape action and policy in ways that will help us affect peace. We co-host events like today's, which is a privilege, because they advance that mission. That we've joined today together to make this happen, and that we are joined today by some remarkable women leaders, some of whom I had the chance to meet at the Green Room, is an even greater privilege for us. So thank you for all that you are all doing collectively to make these issues stay front and center on the global agenda as we come together for the NATO summit. And I now have the great privilege of turning this over to my co-conspirator, Harriet Babbitt, the Vice Chair of the Board of the National Democratic Institute. Thank you.
On behalf of NDI, on behalf of the National Democratic Institute, I join Tino in welcoming you to the launch of Women Lead. Madeleine Albright, as all of you know, was Secretary of State. What you may not know is that before she was Secretary of State, she was an active board member, a very active board member of NDI. And after she was Secretary of State, she went back to her NDI home as the chair of the board of NDI, where she was still working on NDI issues to the very, very end. Madeleine was, of course, very active in many arenas. She said, "No, I'm not monogamous," her words, not mine, but she always made it clear that NDI's work with democracy and women was her very first love. And there wasn't a stronger advocate on the planet for women and for democracy than Madeleine Albright. So we are particularly proud to have been asked to co-host this gathering about women and democracy. Now, for Tino, in the Small World Department, Tino and I spent some pretty pivotal years in our youth's young lives in the lower Rio Grande Valley, in Brownsville, Texas on the U.S. side, and in Matamoros, Tamaulipas on the Mexican side. Although Tino's and my times were obviously many years apart, those border kid experiences made a big impact on both of our lives. Borders are complicated places with special problems and populations with very different needs and expectations. One of the border kid lessons learned was the importance of identifying practical solutions to complex problems. Tino is well known and respected across multiple disciplines for looking at how societies and legal systems can successfully take on those complex problems. NDI and others in the room, of course, have been working successfully for years to open up opportunities for women around the globe. Figuring out how to support women's participation in democratic processes has always been a complex problem. It has now, if anything, become much more difficult. The headwinds have intensified and are being weaponized by authoritarians across the globe. In today's digital age, women in politics and public life face new dimensions of harassment and abuse through misinformation, disinformation, and online violence. These are central elements of authoritarian playbooks. this isn't a coincidence. Today's program is a rich one, and I'm especially pleased we will be learning more about how we can support and scale activities to prevent and respond to violence against women in politics and public life, both online and offline. I know Secretary Albright is cheering us on today, and so let's get busy. And to do that, I'd like to introduce Jen Klein, Assistant to the President and the founding Director of the White House Gender Policy Council. Jennifer Klein. Jennifer Klein, a woman for all seasons.
Thank you so much, Hattie, for that warm welcome, and to Carnegie and NDI for hosting the launch of Women Lead and for your leadership and partnership more generally. I'm also so glad to see, I saw Francina Armengol, who's the president of the Congress of Deputies of Spain. Thank you so much for joining us today. Also, you're about to hear from some of my terrific colleagues, Ambassador Gupta and Jamila Biggio. So thanks, as always, for your leadership and partnership. And I also want to just generally thank our panelists, and this incredibly impressive coalition of leaders, experts, advocates, and visionaries for joining us on the eve of the NATO 75th Anniversary Summit to discuss the advancement of women's leadership as a security imperative. I'm really honored to be here with you. In the Biden-Harris administration, the commitment to women's political and civic participation and the understanding that full and equal participation is critical to democracy, peace, and stability starts at the top. As Vice President Harris, who was, of course, the first woman to serve as Vice President, observed at the 66th Commission on the Status of Women 3 years ago, the status of women is the status of democracy. And of course, the president assembled the first ever gender-balanced cabinet in our nation's history, has appointed judges who reflect the diversity of our country, including the nation's first Black woman to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. And he created, as you just heard, the Gender Policy Council, which I am, of course, personally grateful to him for, because I get to lead it, to guide the administration's foreign and domestic policy to support women's rights and opportunity. But we also know that there's significant work to be done to tackle the barriers to women's political participation and leadership here in the United States and around the world. Despite some progress, women remain grossly underrepresented at all levels of government, serving as heads of state in only 25 out of 193 countries. Women have reached gender parity in national cabinets in only 13 out of 193 countries, and in federal legislatures in only 6 countries around the world. Women still comprise only about a quarter of parliamentarians globally and remain underrepresented in peace negotiations and conflicts across the globe. And now more than ever, as you've already heard, women leaders face 21st century forms of violence, harassment, and abuse for raising their voices. From doxing to targeted disinformation campaigns to deep fake non-consensual intimate images, all of these threaten women's political participation and leadership, which in turn undermine democracy. Recognizing this urgent challenge, the Biden-Harris administration has been steadfast in our work to advance women's political participation, closing gender gaps in leadership, preventing and addressing violence against women in political and public life, and taking action to ensure that technology works for, not against, democracy, have been consistent themes in our democracy promotion efforts and are key additions to NATO's new Women, Peace, and Security policy, which allies will formally endorse at the summit this week. Since President Biden hosted the first Summit for Democracy in 2021, the administration has prioritized efforts to dismantle barriers to women's political participation and build the pipeline of women leaders. And we're working closely with others as part of the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse, through which we've aimed to tackle online threats against women leaders that in turn imperil democracy. But we know that there's much more to be done, so we must align and expand our work together to close the gender gap in leadership. That's why I'm proud to announce that we are rising to meet this challenge by launching Women Lead, Women Leading Effective and Accountable Democracy in the Digital Age. The initiative has 3 goals. First, to invest in programs that build and sustain a diverse pipeline of women leaders. Second, to address barriers to women's participation in public life, both on and offline, including technology-facilitated gender-based violence. And third, to establish a global community of practice of leaders and organizations working to advance women's political and civic participation. With this initiative, we'll increase the scale of resources focused on this critical imperative, share best practices, and connect women leaders and civil society organizations working on the front lines to defend democracy. And we're bringing together other governments, multilateral organizations, civil society partners, and foundations to join us in this critical work. And I want to thank so many of the critical partners who are in this room today for today's launch. I'm excited to share that the coalition behind Women Lead includes more than 34 partners, governments, foundations, civil society, and international organizations who are committing more than $850 million toward the goals of this new initiative. This includes $150 million in investments from the Biden-Harris administration to Women Lead's goals to advance women's political leadership, counter gender-based violence against women leaders online and offline, and to support women's meaningful participation in peace building and conflict resolution, building on the investments we've already made to promote women's political and civic participation through the President's Initiative for Democratic Renewal. We're already seeing progress through the programs supported by this initiative, and I'll just give a few examples. In Tanzania, USAID supported civil society organizations advocating for reform in advance of upcoming local and national elections, which culminated in a new law ratified in March of this year that criminalized acts of violence against women in elections and politics, making Tanzania the first country in Africa to recognize this crime. And in Côte d'Ivoire, through the Political Transition and Inclusion Project, training for women political aspirants and support for voter education contributed to an increase in women's political participation at the local level. Today, women hold over 30% of all local council seats, up from 15% prior to just the 2023 elections. The programs we're supporting with our partners through Women Lead not only advance the participation of women, they make countries and governments more secure. And I can think of no more fitting occasion for the launch of this initiative than on the eve of the NATO 75th Anniversary Summit. The transatlantic relationship is built on a foundation of shared democratic values, including respect for democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. Women's meaningful participation and leadership in security, peace, and decision-making processes is fundamental to the strength of democracies and therefore critical to NATO's present and future effectiveness. Today's announcement is a recognition that, again, the status of women and girls and the stability and security of nations are inextricably linked, and that when women have an equal opportunity to participate and lead, political instability and violence decline. And it's a declaration that a growing coalition of partners will take action to promote our collective stability and security by ensuring the participation of women in all places that decisions are made. We're really looking forward to working with all of you on this shared mission. Thank you very much. And with that, I think I'll turn it back to you, Sandra.
Thanks very much for those excellent first round of opening remarks. And now I'm going to ask Senora Francina Armengol, Speaker of the House in Spain, to come up and deliver her remarks, which will be translated simultaneously for you. Yeah? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I do not speak English. Es un placer para mí participar en la presentación de esta necesaria iniciativa en el marco de esta cumbre de la OTAN. Hoy día, la OTAN es sobre todo una alianza que simboliza el férreo compromiso colectivo de preservar la libertad, la seguridad y la prosperidad. Los Estados miembros trabajamos
Member
para poner
states
en el
strive
centro
to
los derechos
place
humanos
human rights front and center
para proteger
in order to protect
nuestras
our
sociedades del
societies
sufrimiento
from
y
suffering
para garantizar
and to
la igualdad de
ensure
oportunidades.
equal opportunities.
Es, por tanto, digno de
Therefore,
celebración
it's a cause for
que
celebration
precisamente
that
en este
precisely
marco se
within
presente
this
esta iniciativa,
context we are launching this initiative,
porque la igualdad
because
entre el hombre y la
equality
mujer
between
y la
men and
erradicación de
women
la
and the
violencia de
eradication
género
of gender
es
violence
un desafío
is an urgent
urgentísimo en nuestras
challenge
sociedades
in our
democráticas.
democratic societies.
Porque la plena libertad
Because
de las
full,
mujeres y la
liberty
seguridad
of
y la
women
prosperidad
and
no
security and
llegará
prosperity
hasta que la
will never
igualdad sea
arrive
real y
until
efectiva
equality is
en
actually real and
absolutamente
effective
todos los ámbitos.
absolutely everywhere.
Fue Clara Campoamor,
It was Clara
política,
Campoamor,
escritora y abogada
a Spanish
española, protagonista
politician,
de la
author,
conquista del
and
sufragio
lawyer who
femenino en
led
España,
the struggle for
quien dijo,
women's suffrage in Spain,
dejad que la
who
mujer
said,
se manifieste
let
como es,
women be
para
how
conocerla
they are,
y para
that we
juzgarla.
can know her and judge
Cuando
them
pronunció
as they
estas
are. When
palabras
she
era en
pronounced these words, that was
1931
1931,
y estaba
and
defendiendo
she was
el derecho del voto de
championing
las
the
mujeres.
right of women to vote.
Hoy, casi un
Today,
siglo
nearly
después,
a
todavía hay
century
países en el
later,
mundo
there are
donde
still
las
countries in the
mujeres
world
son
in which
consideradas
women
ciudadanas
are
de segunda,
considered second-class citizens,
donde no pueden
where
votar,
they are not
donde
allowed
para
to vote,
participar de la vida
where, in
pública
order to take
han de
part in
ser
public life,
tuteladas por un hombre.
they do so under the guardianship of men.
Según ONU Mujeres,
According to
el
UN
pasado
Women,
año ningún
last
país
year,
consiguió la
there was
paridad
no
de
country
género
that achieved
y menos del
gender parity,
1% de las
and
mujeres
fewer
y
than
niñas
1% of
viven
women
en
and
países con
girls live
niveles
in countries
altos
with high levels
de empoderamiento
of
femenino.
women
también,
empowerment.
Según datos de
And
ONU
also,
Mujeres,
according to
a
UN
fecha del
Women,
pasado mes,
as of last
solo
month,
en 27
only
de los
in
195
27 of the
países en el mundo,
195 countries in the
las
world
mujeres se desempeñan como jefas de Estado
are
y o de
women
gobierno.
serving as heads of state and government.
En España,
In
en las
Spain,
últimas décadas,
Over
hemos
the last
avanzado
decades,
muchísimo.
we have made great strides.
Hoy tenemos
Today,
leyes de
we have
representación paritaria,
laws of gender parity,
leyes contra la violencia de
laws
género,
against gender
para
violence,
la igualdad retributiva,
and equal pay,
normativas antidiscriminatorias y también
anti-discrimination
para la
laws,
igualdad
as well as to
efectiva.
ensure effective equality.
Aún así, no podemos
Even
permitirnos el
still, we
descanso.
can't lower
La
our
historia
guard.
nos ha demostrado
History has
que
taught
los
us
derechos de
that
las mujeres
women's
son
rights are
frágiles,
tenuous,
que en muchas
and
ocasiones se
oftentimes
revierten,
they slip away
desaparecen.
and disappear.
Pero además, no podemos descansar en
But
esta lucha
we can't let
porque
up in this
instaladas
fight
en este
because
sistema profundamente
as we
desigual,
are immersed in this
nuestras
deeply
sociedades
unequal
están perdiendo
system,
mucho.
our societies are missing out on so much.
El liderazgo de las mujeres
Women
es un
leadership
motor
is
necesario
a
y
necessary
transformador.
engine of transformation.
Se basa en el
It
compromiso y en la
is characterized
flexibilidad
by
y se
compromise
sustenta
and
en la cooperación
flexibility,
entre
and it is
iguales.
rooted in cooperation among equals.
Se apoya en el diálogo, en la comunicación y en las fuerzas y las
It's
energías
based on dialogue,
horizontales.
communication, and horizontal relationships or
No hay duda de que
energy.
es una forma de
Without a doubt,
liderazgo
it
responsable,
is a responsible form of
solidaria
leadership that
y
is
versátil,
supportive and versatile,
pensada para construir relaciones
that
en vez
seeks
de
to
para
build
destruirlas.
relations rather than destroy them.
Porque la empatía
Because empathy
también puede
can
ser
also be
competitiva.
competitive.
La empatía
Empathy
también genera
can
progreso y
generate
crecimiento.
progress and growth as well.
Necesitamos
We need
garantizar
to
de una vez
ensure,
la igualdad
once and
real
for
y
all,
efectiva,
real and effective equality,
porque no habrá verdadera
because
justicia
there will
social
never
sin
be
ella,
true social justice without
y
it,
porque nuestras
and because
democracias
our
no serán
democracies
plenas
will never
si
be
permanecen
full
sustentadas
democracies if not,
en la
if they
desigualdad.
continue to be rooted in inequality.
Decía Michelle Bachelet
Michelle Bachelet
que si
said
una mujer
that
entra en
if a
política,
woman
mejora su vida personal.
goes into politics, it improves her personal life.
Si entramos muchas mujeres
If
en
many
política,
women were to get into politics,
mejoramos la
we
política
will improve politics,
y añado, mejoramos nuestras
and at
sociedades.
the same time, we will improve our societies.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
And now it's my great pleasure to introduce and then be part of a panel, apparently. There weren't enough of us. No, it's not true. But first of all, let me please introduce Jamil Bijou, who is the coordinator for gender at USAID. Jamil, please.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sandra. So we now are thrilled to have the opportunity to hear from an incredible panel of experts and leaders that I am going to invite to the stage. And as I do that, I want to just highlight I join with my hats leading gender equality at the U.S. Agency for International Development, and we are so thrilled to be at the table with this incredible group of partners. So let me invite our panel up, please. So everyone come up, and I'll introduce you as we get started. So I was just speaking to how thrilled USAID is and U.S. government partners and our collective partners that are joining us in this initiative of being able to come and reflect together on the different ways our organizations are investing in advancing women's political leadership around the world. On USAID's side, we are very thrilled that two of our flagship programs are contributing to the goals of this initiative. We have one that we launched through the Summit for Democracy on advancing women's and girls' civic and political leadership. And this takes a holistic, multi-year approach to do as this initiative, Global Women Lead, is doing, of building a comprehensive, multi-year approach of building a pipeline of women and girl political and civic leaders in politics, in peace building, in transition processes, improving the enabling environment to support and encourage their leadership, and countering violence against women in politics and public life. So we're kind of taking what you're hearing about Women Lead, and we're trying to help take that forward in 10 focus countries to start with, and are partnering with a collective of organizations in doing that. We also have a flagship program on combating technology-facilitated gender-based violence that we're very thrilled, that includes a partnership with Irene here. So we're thrilled to be able to take the learning from that and bring it to the community of practice that we have and we're going to speak to. And then finally, we are aligning efforts that our Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Bureau are investing in and launching. So the work that USAID is doing around democracy more broadly, around digital democracy more specifically, we are taking a gender lens to that work so that we're not kind of treating Women Lead on the side here and then all the other work we do collectively on democracy and digital democracy or on peace and security over here, but rather really thinking about how those are connected, which is a theme that we'll be talking about together on this panel. And then the last piece I want to highlight, which we're so excited about, is that this conversation you'll hear from the panel is part of what our broader community of practice will be engaging in. And so the Women Lead initiative, all the partners that are joining us in a community of practice. So we have a space for exchanging knowledge, exchanging lessons, looking for opportunities to partner, looking for where the themes are. And we'll very much hear that in today's panel. And this effort, this community of practice, it's hosted by the Network for Gender Inclusive Democracy that we launched last year at the Summit for Democracy. And it very much connects with a few key coordination platforms in this space as well. We've got the Critical Global Partnership on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse with its focus on TFGBV. We've got the OECD with the DAC Gender Network. So just to kind of note what today's discussion connects with that work of this community of practice as we kick it off. So we're very thrilled. I will introduce our panel now that we have experts from different parts of our shared community that are bringing their expertise to the table. So we have Saskia Breckenmacher, who's a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Her research focuses on trends in democracy, gender equality, and civic space around the world. We have Irene Mwendoa, who is the Executive Director of Policy, a feminist collective that is among its many other activities, also a partner for us in our Transforming Digital Spaces activity. She has incredible expertise around strengthening policies, legal frameworks around elections, data, technology, and so on. We have Ambassador Jacqueline O'Neill, who's Canada's first ambassador for women, peace, and security. Since 2019, she has advised the Government of Canada on strengthening its global leadership on women, peace, and security, and the effective implementation of National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. And finally, our MC, who joins us with many hats, Sandra Papera, who is the Director for Gender, Women, and Democracy at the National Democratic Institute. So we are going to jump into the questions that we have for you all and are so grateful for you for joining us. So I'm going to start off with Saskia. And Saskia, we'd love for you to help us understand more about the evidence base that is informing the work of Women Lead. What do we know about the connection between women's political participation and the strength of democracy? What do we not know? What additional research is needed to help us better understand that link and thereby help us strengthen our own work in investing collectively in democracy around the world? Please.
Thank you for that question and for convening this conversation, to all of you for coming. So I think my very simple answer to your question would be that women need democracy and democracy needs women. So what do I mean by that? So when we look at existing research, we see that there's a strong mutually reinforcing relationship between democracy on the one hand and gender equality on the other. So the countries around the world that are most gender equal, where women have access to justice, to rights, to participation, security, tend to also be the most democratic countries. So the two clearly go hand in hand. Now, the researchers will tell you that correlation does not equal causation, right? So we have this correlation. It's actually quite hard to unpack what's causing what. Is gender equality helping us strengthen democracy? Is democracy strengthening gender equality? And I think this is actually an area where more research would be really helpful to untangle that relationship. But there are several things that we do actually know, and let me just walk through a few of them. So first of all, I say that women need democracy because we have a lot of research showing that over the past century, we've seen the most rapid gender equality progress in places where women have had the space to organize, to mobilize, to build strong movements for gender equality change, right? Whether it's the right to vote, the right to be protected from violence and discrimination, et cetera. So in very authoritarian countries, that space doesn't exist. So you might have policy change, but it comes from the top down. So I think we can all agree that for continued gender equality progress, right, women really depend on democratic space to be able to drive that change from the bottom up. But then the flip side is also true, right? Democracy depends on women and women's participation. And why do I say that? First of all, women have long been leaders in movements for democratic change, and we still see that in countries around the world today. And some of you might be familiar with the research by Zoe Marks and Erica Genueth at the Harvard Kennedy School, right, showing that mass movements for change, political change, that include women in large numbers, not only are more effective at achieving their goals of political transformation, they also are more likely to result in egalitarian democracy. So having women be part of movements for change ends up leading to more democratic outcomes. At the same time, women's political representation and participation is really essential if we think about the quality of democracy, right? So we're not just talking about having elections and that's it. We're actually talking about high quality representation. And here we have massive evidence showing that it really matters who's at the decision-making table. So when we have more diverse people, including women and men, represented, different legislative issues come up, different policy issues come up. And in some ways, that's not surprising. People bring their life experiences, they bring their bodies, right? The way they move into the world, into the political process and into the issues that they care about. So we're seeing women legislators speak up much more often on issues related to gender equality and discrimination, but also issues to social policy, healthcare, childcare, right? Issues that have traditionally been affecting women very disproportionately. And so they bring them up more than male legislators do. So I think if we care about high quality representation and responsiveness of our political systems to all of its citizens, women's participation is non-negotiable. And then the final point I'd like to make is, to try and understand this relationship between gender equality, women's participation, and democracy, we only need to look at what's happening around the world today, as many countries are de-democratizing. So as democracy is getting eroded, we see that almost always representation, and we see women being pushed out of politics, sometimes through violence. So just as I would say gender equality and democracy are mutually reinforcing, so are authoritarianism, misogyny, and patriarchy.
Well done. Thank you so much. That was a very powerful synopsis, Saskia, that I think we will all be drawing on, but underscores, again, the case that the research makes very clearly of why initiatives like Women Lead, why our partners are coming together today to really focus on, given that research, what we must collectively do to advance women's leadership in politics, in public life, and in security. And so there I'd like to turn to Ambassador O'Neill as we look at the priorities around women's leadership as critical to both democracy and security. These have been priorities for Canada. Canada's joining us in aligning its investments in women's leadership, in democracy and security at the table together with the Women Lead Initiative. These are priorities for you with your hat as the Ambassador for Women, Peace, and Security. So I'd love to hear your reflections as we bring a security lens into this as well, and as we look to what's happening now of how the launch of Women Lead complements the discussions happening among allies this week at the NATO summit.
Thank you, and hi everyone. It's a humbling space to be in. Many of you have been my teachers on women, peace, and security, or Tino used a great word of co-conspirators. I feel like we are many co-conspirators in the room. And that was a great overview, Saskia. I hope you publish that in its exact form so we can circulate it and reproduce it. You're asking about a bit about Canada's kind of view on this. I mean, I'd say first of all, we see gender equality, which includes women's participation in leadership, as a fundamental and non-negotiable human right, and that we have to advocate for it in and of its own self. We also see it, as you were referencing, and as Saskia just explained, as a fundamental threat to democracy and to security. And this is something that we hear and see everywhere all the time. Anywhere I get to travel as ambassador for Women, Peace, and Security within Canada, we see it affecting women at community organizing levels, all the way up to our Deputy Prime Minister. Faces targeted, gender-based violence online and other threats, disinformation, misinformation campaigns. About four days ago, I was in Mindanao in the southern Philippines and had a roundtable with a group of young women, peace builders and activists, and said, what's up? What are your biggest challenges? What opportunities do you see? What threats? And they said, the single biggest thing they said is we're facing a ton of attacks online. We're being accused of horrible things. We have disinformation campaigns against us. We see this all the time. It's very hard to get other young women interested, organized, mobilizing. And just earlier in that week, so within the last 7 days, a friend of theirs who had received a ton of online hate and targeted harassment was shot and killed while she was distributing campaign literature. And the Philippines is at a super precarious position where they've signed a peace agreement. It's before they've had elections. And so things are tenuous, things are trying to hold, and this is undermining the process. And so we're starting to see, I think, technology-facilitated gender-based violence appear in more policy frameworks. So the NATO policy on women, peace, and security that hopefully will be approved this week acknowledges this as a threat to security. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has a new regional plan of action that acknowledges this as a security threat. Many of our countries' national action plans on women, peace, and security do so. But I think that said, we're still seeing that this is often primarily viewed as a threat against individuals, not against institutions, and not against democracy itself, and not as a threat to our security itself. And ultimately, this is tech-facilitated gender-based violence, the undermining of gender equality through attacks on women, undermines institutions, and it undermines institutions by trying to undermine the individuals in those institutions. And we have to, any security organization says to counter a threat, you have to understand the threat, and we have to really look at the pathology of this. And it's similar everywhere in the world. It plays on heavily racist tropes, so women of color, indigenous women, members of community minorities are often dramatically targeted at rates more than even other women are. It exploits stereotypes on women's competencies, their sexuality, how good you are as a mother, as a member of the family. It accuses women of being puppets of outside regimes, of being controlled by the West or whatever that means. And as a result, we see all the impacts that Saskia just described. So for Canada, asking ourselves, what do we do? How do we protect these institutions? How do we protect our security as a result? One of the most clear answers is to support women-led human rights and civil society organizations and feminist movements. And so we do that in a few ways, different channels. We have a number of initiatives like the Equality Fund. We started that and co-led that with a number of others in 2019 with an initial $300 million investment. We have an Alliance for Feminist Movements, the Women's Voice in Leadership program. We started in 2017 with $150 million and just renewed it for another 5 years with $195 million. We have now the alignment with Women Lead. And these programs, these partnerships, these collaborations are really important because what we hear constantly from women-led civil society organizations is that it's not only money that we need, it's the right type of money. And that money has to be for core funding, not project-based. It has to be long-term funding. It has to be flexible. It has to provide for women and women's groups to actually network and build movements and alliances. It has to have less reporting. We love reporting in Canada, and we, as many of you know, I'm looking at some of you in particular, we get a lot of reports that if we did a different type of risk analysis or assessment, we certainly wouldn't ask for. And it needs to address women's safety, including women's online safety and protection from tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And we're not, as an institution, fully fit for purpose in that way. So we are in this middle stage where we need to work through a number of partnerships and organizations like that, which is especially important now given the global backlash, the resistance, et cetera. And I know we can talk more about it, but it's clear to us that a core part of this answer is supporting local feminist movements and women's rights organizations.
Thank you, Ambassador. You connected the dots there between our work to advance democracy, to advance security, and our work to support women's leadership and their protection from violence against women in politics and public life, including both offline and online. And I'd now like to turn to Irene to reflect more about the online aspects of that. With your work leading advocacy for digital rights across Africa, would love to hear your reflections on why you are seeing it as critical to address women's political empowerment and participation by including a focus on efforts to counter technology-facilitated gender-based violence and gendered disinformation.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. Thank you, Ambassador, for bringing it up that it's funds that are dedicated to feminist organizing that actually provide the evidence, which in my case I call gender data, that informs technology companies and governments to really shape policies on these issues. But to start off, again, thank you for the wonderful background. And to give an example, how many director of communications are in the room? Or if you work in comms, raise your hand. The work is cut out for you. Just to lighten this by saying there's a lot of, I'll start with jargon. When you look at issues to do with technology-facilitated gender-based violence, some of our governments are really trying to put measures to curb or to engage some of these platforms, but there are issues of engaging with these platforms because of technical expertise, of also where our governments are, the bureaucracies, and therefore that there needs to be a lot of awareness creation where you use different tools, storytelling, to show how grim or how dangerous this vice is. And why did I begin by asking how many directors of communications are in the room? It's because when you look at how women politicians organize in Africa, in very many countries in Africa, many of them, because of resources or expertise, end up hiring social media managers. Who are their social media managers? Before the elections, maybe 6 months, 3 months to the elections, 1 year, it's a man. So if it's a man, when they're called, Madam so-and-so, today you don't look nice, the social media manager who's a man will fight with the other man who's abusing the women politician. So you can see how there are so many fundamentals that lead to technology-facilitated based violence that stem from things to do with content moderation. And I was speaking to Sandra earlier and telling her there are platforms who've cut down their budgets or their departments on content moderation altogether. What does that do to the year of elections, which is 2024? It means anything goes online. It means more women saying, you know what, let me not campaign this year. And just to draw back in on, what Women Lead and the Global Partnership can do going forward, there's a lot of work being done by different civic organizations. These are organizations that use data, that really use technologies such as social media analytics to really show the evidence and the issues that affect women online. With the support of USAID, actually, we were able to understand one of the issues particularly facing Africa is evidence that can be used by governments to say, when I go to Meta in Menlo Park or Apple or whichever tech company, this is the evidence. This is what you're doing to our women leaders. Mm-hmm. So support from Women Lead, the Global Partnership, will go a long way, again, to supporting Africans who speak very many languages to put out evidence in that case. The other thing that I've seen, we are also seeing from our research is there is an issue of trauma and infrastructure challenges when it comes to content moderation. If you've been following some of the cases happening in the continent, there are about 5 to 10 cases spread across Africa against some popular digital platforms. And what's happened is that the workers themselves who are expected to perform content moderation are faced with economic violence. So if you're underpaid and you're not receiving the right redress or psychosocial support, will you be able to wake up and do content moderation well? Which again limits the beautiful work that should be done during the election year against women politicians to really incentivize them to continue engaging digitally. So we've seen that more and more our governments, duty bearers have a very huge role to play to catch up and to understand the importance of women being safe, both online and offline. And I was speaking to one of our partners, actually a member of the advisory board under the Transform program, and we were also looking at the new forms of violence that are shaping up against the election year and against events. We are now seeing few partners, spouses, setting up accounts to abuse their women, either online because of different economic empowerment processes. And we were wondering, how can platforms be held to account to ensure that some of these do not permeate? But you can see it's all informed by different forms of both societal and economic motivations. The other thing I wanted to draw to your attention is so many women rights organizations on the continent still organize traditionally, still engage communities in a very traditional way. However, technology is fast-paced. It's resourceful. You need to buy a SIM card, you need to buy data, you need to buy a smartphone, you need to buy your iPads and your laptops. But very many communities are still yet to get to this level in different parts of Africa. So there needs to be always a recognition of combined efforts, both offline and online. And when you're speaking to communities, is you target some of these people who have been seen to be causing more harm. So you try and work through religious leaders, try to work through school leaders and community champions and so forth. So to date, then we've seen police, the judiciary, and several security apparatus are also some of the key players and people to engage to ensure that they rush and prioritize to offer solutions against technology-facilitated gender-based violence. And with CSO support, with Women Lead, for instance, and the global partnership support through research and through evidence that's coming out of our work and women rights organizing, we are able to really ensure that they're able to understand the different solutions that are available and that can be used to offer redress to women leaders who continue to face this vice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. You are highlighting some really critical barriers and challenges that women leaders are facing today around the world and in Africa specifically, where your organization is working. And very much these are issues that we collectively through Women Lead and with the TFGBV side in partnership with the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse are working to both strengthen how we individually or as partners are investing in addressing these issues and how we can collectively make more progress. So by sharing these reflections. As we look at the issue of violence against women in politics and public life, we, of course, look at the critical work that NDI has done, and Sandra, under your leadership, to name, address, and prevent violence against women in politics, from the work you've done through the Not the Cost campaign, to NDI's work to address technology-facilitated GBV more broadly. So I'd love to hear more from you, Sandra, of what examples are you hearing? How are issues of violence against women in politics and public life, online and offline, affecting the opportunities for women's political leadership? So why, from your perspective, is it important that violence against women in politics and public life is one of the 3 objectives of the Women Lead initiative?
No, thanks very much, Jamila. It's been great to listen to friends, people I've been working with in this town for the best part of a decade. Saskia, you were even fresher and younger when we first met. But I think, you know, there is a common thread here, and I think we have to acknowledge it. When we launched the Not the Cost campaign in 2016, our call to action probably had 85% focused on the physical space, and maybe 15% on the online space. By the time 5 years later we revisited the call to action, those figures had flipped astronomically. And the focus now very much is on what's happening online. It's not that women aren't still being attacked in person. It's not even that the online space doesn't lead to what we call the sort of gateway effect to the offline space. I mean, the classic case, you'll all remember Jo Cox in 2016. She had been trolled viciously online by a white male nationalist from the UK. And the police knew who he was. So did the Southern National Law Conference, is it? Yeah, they knew who he was here because he was part of a white supremacist network. And he finally found her at her constituency office and murdered her on the pavement outside. So we know that the online violence can actually manifest offline with absolutely deleterious effects. So there is this business about where this violence sits, and can we really even talk sensibly about online, offline anymore? Aren't we all just living one life? You know, we don't switch off one life to engage with the other. Either way around. I remember Shei Akiwawa, who runs an organization called Glitch in the UK. And she started this organization because she was a young, black political activist in the Labour Party. She went to the European Parliament, made a speech, and her life changed. In an instant, her life changed. And she launched this NGO in the UK to address these issues. And when we had her here to speak at one of our events, she said, you know, Sandra, when I sleep, she was single then, when I sleep, the closest thing to me is my phone. Literally, it was right beside her. And this business about how the technology has invaded our private and personal space is really massive. And she also made that point. She said, yes, she knows her mum tells her to get offline, but getting offline doesn't stop her life, actually. It's one life. And understanding this is really important. I do think we've learned a lot about a lot of the points that have been made here. What's said, the narratives are important. And we are doing increasing amounts of work to track those narratives. Who's saying what? And to whom is really important. What are the terms of the debate that are being used? How are women being attacked? That's key. Multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder alliances are one of the key ways to address all these issues in the round. There's not going to be a single silver bullet to address this. I do think we need to understand sort of the structural nature of this in some contexts. You know, people don't like us talking about the patriarchy, but it is very real and really, really good at reinventing itself all the time. So I think, you know, we have to understand that these structural pieces are key, and the context of those structures is, of course, the long-term inequality and that persistent discrimination that women face. So we understand that power is at the basis of this. Women's experience of disempowerment, as Naila Kabir has called it, is key. And therefore, that takes us to the perennial question, and I'm going to answer it before somebody in the audience asks me, it is, when do you talk to men? And I say, I'm in politics. 75% of the people I talk to are men. That's the reality of it. But the point is that what we're saying is understanding that the space that one gender occupies is disproportionate to it, to its role. But then at the same time, changing that space is not an easy task. When we were in the green room, Irene and I were kind of just talking about things like how the issue of gender impacts and it sort of is mitigated by things like ownership. You know, who owns newspapers? Who owns the online spaces? And that connectivity between where women sit and where women are impacted is really important. Tino made a comment on it when he was speaking earlier on, that link between how gender shows up in our real world, in our social contracts, in our political engagements, is something that we probably have not done enough work on, although my colleague Moira Whalen and her team have done some fantastic work on the business model and how the business model, particularly for the digital platforms, actually hardwires in a persistence of gender inequality because, unfortunately, hate sells. And that's the point. And we understand that some of these issues are not necessarily about the misogynistic harm directly, but about how we structure ourselves as societies and how the societal pieces fit together, and sometimes and often against the interests of the other majority, women and other marginalized groups across the piece. So there's a lot, and I think we have done a lot of admiring the problem. Again, as my colleague Moria says, we've done a lot of admiring the problem. We do have some understanding of some solutions too. And I think the Women Lead Partnership, the community of practice, all these things are going to allow us to hopefully distill and share the more encouraging and the more hopeful solutions to these issues. But I'll only just finish by saying that there is a challenge of change. Two really challenges of change. One is that, of course, when you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression, right? So for a lot of the men who we're going to have to seek to displace, this is going to be a challenge, and we're going to see more backlash probably. How to engage men, and some of those issues and the programs we are running on norm change and behavioral change may have some opportunity in that. And the second challenge is the challenge the challenge of intersectionality. And intersectionality isn't a cool thing, and it doesn't just mean multiple identities. It means the difference in power positioning between folks within the same group with multiple identities. And if we are going to discuss, leaving no one behind, then we have to really engage with this issue. And those of us with privilege will need to cede some of that in order that we help those in our group with less privilege to move forward as well. So I think the structural piece, as I grow older, the structural piece becomes more and more obvious to me. And shaking those foundations is a new goal. And I think it's a goal that we have some prospects of actually achieving.
You've highlighted how, I think, across the Senate. Thank you, Sandra, for those reflections and for all that NDI has done in this space. And you've highlighted in those reflections what we've heard across the panel of how critical it is that we are working in a multi-sectoral, multi-partner way to be able to tackle these issues. Because as we learn more about it, as we learn more from the research, as we learn more from what programming is working, as the business model and the digital technologies continue to evolve, it is going to take that broad coalition to be able to see the kinds of results that we want to see. So I'm now going to do a final lightning round of the panel, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience. And the question I want to ask each of you is, as we look at what is success for the Women Lead Initiative? What do you want to see this initiative succeed in the short and the long term? And as we sit on the sidelines of the NATO summit now, how does that connect with our security goals, our women, peace, and security goals? So if we can have just a few quick thoughts from each of you in this lightning round, and then we'll open it up. Saskia, please.
Sure. I mean, I think given these parallel attacks we're seeing on democracy and gender equality, what we need are really broad-based coalitions, right? And these are not just coalitions of governments, but also of civil society, of foundations, everyone who's committed to a reform agenda. So I think a few metrics, and I'll be very brief, that come to mind for Women Lead. I think we'd want to, first of all, see partners that are part of this leading by example, right? So we heard earlier about how you're trying to integrate a gender lens across different areas that USAID is engaged in, for example. I think that's really important. So as we look to the future and see really critical issues coming up like AI, right? AI regulation, climate change, migration, do we have a lens there that women need to be part of those discussions, right? Within our own countries and internationally. I think that's number one. Number two, I think seeing really strong diplomatic efforts in this area. So seeing governments stand up for women's political rights in international forums where we're increasingly seeing these traditional ideas about gender making progress. And we need strong coalitions to push back against that and maintain the international norms that we have, but also strengthen them. And also, have that kind of lens integrated in bilateral diplomatic negotiations, of course. And then the last thing I think, and Irene spoke to that, is resources. So I think a really critical marker of success will be if the initiative is able to mobilize more resources in this area to help support efforts, right, initiatives to support women's political leadership, to channel more resources to women's movements that are the front lines of pushing for change. So I think, in short, leading by example, I think strong diplomatic efforts and resources, I think, would be three really important markers of success.
Thank you so much, Saskia. Irene, over to you.
Okay. Anyone from the private sector in the room? For me, there is no conversation without working with the private sector, the data scientists, the product designers who are building some of these tools, so that when they are speaking to the owners of these platforms, unfortunately, the billionaires, they can whisper ideas that can really transform women's lives. I mean, they have women in their lives. They think they are politicians, moms, sisters. So fundamentally, I know some have managed to get through to them. So having the private sector have deep-rooted conversations about human-centered design will be a very great step. And the Women Lead program has the opportunity to bring community actors to the table to speak to some of these private sector communities.
Thank you, Irene. Jackie?
I really like to see the day when we have to stop, we get to stop justifying why women need to be included, how this is disproportionately affecting women, what the research says, and that institutions, including the private sector, that have barriers and that perpetuate problems, the burden is shifted on them to explain why they still have those. So I'd like people to stop asking, what research do we have, and get a little bit on the defensive themselves. And I think that'll be an important shift overall.
Thank you. Sandra?
No, thanks. First of all, before I forget, let me just say, if you have not yet seen, read, bought Saskia and Catherine's book, you should do so. It's excellent, and I really say that from the bottom of my heart. It was a good read. Thank you. It's just a real strong compilation of what we know. The analysis is great. The recommendations are good. So please do take the opportunity to look at that. I think we should focus on solutions that are inherently empowering, because I think all too often there are solutions that we, again, as sort of privileged women as well, put forward that don't necessarily provide that inherent empowerment to our partners, sisters across the world, and to societies. And I think it's important, because as we look around the place, we are struck by the numbers and types of people who are just feeling completely marginalized and left behind and forgotten. And the security implications of that are visible on our screens every night, with people losing their lives in boats and all sorts of other things. The criminality, the international criminality that goes with that, all those sorts of issues are deeply, deeply impacting security. So I guess that'll be some things that some of those folks in the other rooms will be talking about. But the solutions to those issues should themselves be inherently empowering. And one of the things that I have a neuralgic spot about is the whole issue of legal ID. I think legal ID doesn't necessarily mean, and I'm British, and so of course as soon as you say legal ID in the UK, people are going, no, we don't carry cards like that. That's what foreigners do. But it's not a question even of having to carry an identity card. It's a question of being visible before the state. And what that does is it layers and begins to layer empowerment towards you. It, in India, where they've, put out, hundreds of millions of the Aadhaar card, and in Pakistan, where they've issued the Benazir card, which are social welfare cards, we understand that because they are focused on women, women have felt empowered just by having those cards. And yes, resources come to them, but the fact is that they are identified, that somebody is saying their name, as the tradition here is. So the solutions must themselves be inherently empowering. And I think if we can keep that in mind, then we have all the chances of success.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Well, we've got a good call to action for ourselves as we kick off the Women Lead initiative with other partners and the $850 million we have committed altogether in the ways in which we are each investing in women's leadership, women's political leadership around the world. I'm thrilled now to be able to open the floor and take some questions from the audience. So we will have some mics coming around. So if we have you can raise your hand and our colleagues will come to you with a microphone. I think if we start off here. So if you can introduce yourself and your organization and keep your questions succinct, please.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all of your comments. My name is Christine Beckard. I'm a research fellow at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. I research technology-facilitated gender-based violence and its intersection with women, peace, and security. We just released a report, and many of our findings echo all of the things that you've been saying. But I wanted to ask about another thing that our research finds is that a lot of efforts to address TFGBV focus not only on individual women, but on individual bad actors, while in reality, many of these campaigns of violence are carried out as large-scale coordinated strategies by state and non-state actors. The Taliban, China, Russia, India all come to mind. And so I'm wondering if you can elaborate on how Women Lead will engage with this kind of large-scale coordinated form of violence against women. Thank you.
Ms. Morris still here.
Thank you so much. Somebody want to take that question?
Immediately, I'll speak about the support we had from USAID. We were able to do social media analytics for content creators in Kenya immediately after the elections. You know, what was shaping them getting gigs, you know, they need to work with brands, marketing agencies. And what we found actually from our data is trends on perpetrator violence, what you're talking about, and what in the region, Africa and Kenya, and I would say Kenya specifically, it's very, it's based on knowledge. It's based on you being able to use a smart device. And we were able to develop at least 7 to 10 perpetrator personas, whereas there are some which are very well coordinated, as you're saying. In our context is social and cultural norms. Sometimes it's a sister who's jealous of you because you're a content creator and you're getting big jobs. So these also play a very huge role. What I can say, Women Lead has an opportunity to use data, social media analytics, to really show these patterns, because it's really about evidence to be able to have conversations with these platforms. Yeah.
Can I jump in really quickly too? I think a big place that we're at in the world still is trying to help our organizations and institutions understand this as a systemic threat by the institution, or like the groups that you talked about, and not just by individual bad actors. And, you know, really clear and very sad example of that is Russia's disinformation and attacks vis-a-vis Ukraine in the region and on Canadians. And I'm gonna, if it's okay, highlight a colleague of mine, Lieutenant Colonel Melanie Lake is here in the audience. Mel can put up her hand. Canadian Armed Forces member, led a Canadian NATO training mission in Ukraine, the first full rotation before the full-scale invasion, and has been a target of online attacks that are come across as being done by an individual, but are clearly, if you took half a minute to really disaggregate and understand what was happening, is being perpetuated by state or state actors who have a strong interest in perpetuating these narratives. And across our institutions, including the Canadian Armed Forces, for example, we're really trying to deepen the understanding that this is a systemic threat by an acknowledged adversary, not by, you know, a few bad apples or misogynists in a community. And I think that's a real huge level of understanding the institutional vulnerability. Mel, you know, is not the only one to have been victim to this. We have Canadian politicians targeted. We have other members of security organizations, institutions, public sector, and that's a very deliberate way of undermining, for example, Canada's support for NATO's work in Ukraine. It increases the cost to the government, you know, political support, actual cost, morale, public support, et cetera, for this work. So this is being done in a very deliberate, very specific way, as you were talking about. And we really have to move past as organizations recognizing that it's not an individual attack on an individual, even if it's individual amplified by AI and others. It's very much state-directed in many, many cases, or organization or group-directed.
And I'm only going to say we need also to be careful not to single out single bad state actors, right? All of us need to, in all our corridors, need to be really very well kind of focus on how incipient this stuff is. It just starts in all our spaces. And it's part and parcel of this whole, polarization, the decline of pluralism. I mean, what is this about, really? It's about declining pluralism. It's about shutting down dissent in order to control a narrow political discourse. You don't actually have to be an authoritarian to have those inclinations, right? So I think just for all of us to be very well aware of this and to call it out if you can when you see it. But these are traits that once seeded will only grow, and the vine will kind of strangle all of us.
Okay, we have microphones. Okay, let's take one on this side. We have somebody back here. We're going to take 3 questions now if we can, and then we'll have questions from the panel there, and then we'll shift into our final remarks. Please.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful panel. My name is Sasha. I'm a program coordinator at the Aspen Institute. And my question is kind of twofold. I think a lot of what we've talked about today is about gender disinformation and state actors and non-state actors pushing gender disinformation via social media that suppresses women's political participation. So with this in mind, and one of the panelists did talk about the lack of evidence for specifically African governments that is causing this issue to be solved at a slower pace. How do you provide this evidence with so much gender disinformation online that is perpetuated by state governments? And how do you find that intersection to find a solution within both of those problems? Thank you.
Take a couple more. Should we respond now or take a couple more?
Yeah, why don't we'll do a quick response and then.
No, absolutely agree. We had this really wonderful conference in Nairobi in March, and one of the sort of 2 big kind of fault lines that came up. First of all, the imbalance of power between the individual and the tech platform, number one. I mean, somebody was saying it earlier on, shifting the focus for cleaning up this mess to the tech platforms rather than just giving women many more tools to load onto their things in order to stop things happening. That doesn't work. So the imbalance of power there. But the second piece is in some cases, and again Irene alluded to it, the imbalance of power between nation states and the tech platforms too. We're dealing with levels of power in some situations which are quite beyond what has been known before, maybe taking us back into those dark days of imperialist and mercantilist history or whatever it is. But the point is that the ability of some member states to actually protect their citizens and to take strong action can sometimes be tempered by their equal readiness to try and shut down the discourse and control the space. So it's a very difficult and dangerous line to walk, but we have to find a way through. But I agree with you, it's a mess.
Irene, do you want to add quickly?
Yeah. Quickly, NDI actually, hi Moira, really have supported organizations like Policy and many others in the region to do work on lexicon building. Lexicon building in our local languages, especially during election season, help the platforms to really consider how to moderate some of the content. So you come in either 6 weeks before an election and show these are the hot quote-unquote abuses that are happening during this election season, because it changes with every election. And code switching, you're young, I can see. In Kenya, I'll use a simple example. I was speaking to Katia or other folks a few weeks ago, and I shared with them, polka dot is simply a design. But before an election in Kenya, it just means you're stained and you cannot be my leader. And it's almost always used against women of different tribes. So you can see it's very important to put out the evidence in forms of the lexicons that show this is what's happening on your platforms. And I'm grateful because I've been checking of 50 countries in Africa, Kenya is the only country that did, and the Kenya government hooray, I can give them 1 point, a lexicon during the 2022 general elections. And you can check it out. If you just Google Kenya government lexicon, you'll see it. And it has a few examples of very hot contested abuses. You can see it's part of the evidence. And we can simply say, we can speak to the Twitter owners and tell them you did nothing about it. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, let's bring a question on from this side of the room, please.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Darcy Droud. I'm a fellow here in the Asia program at Carnegie. Something that certainly I do in my research on gender, and I think a lot of us do, is we focus on intercultural, transnational, even multi-party engagement on when it comes to gender issues, gender rights, gender discrimination. But something that I'm increasingly interested in and puzzling over, especially when it comes to digital lives, is intergenerational aspects of this. So something I'm wondering about is how can we tackle both generational gaps in how they're experiencing the forms of discrimination or access to things that are increasingly digitized, financial, all of these sorts of things. So that's the kind of the policy aspect of it. And then how can we work on intergenerational leadership in these areas? What sort of strategy can we engage as we work forward on this? Thanks.
Thank you so much. Important question. Sandra, did you want to start?
Well, I think it's interesting because I think we had a bit of a debate even about the name of the initiative. So it's Women Lead and in the Digital Age. Okay, so in that way, we are recognizing that just because you were born yesterday or 10 years ago, doesn't mean you're the only person that needs to understand how to operate in the digital age. So there is, I think, an accent on issues of access, all those things that we've always known, meaningful connectivity. I love meaningful connectivity because it means that you're supposed to be able to have access to a device at the right speeds, at the right costs, and so forth. So there are those sorts of issues. So I think we are aware of that intergenerational piece, but I don't think it's a static. I think it's something that we need to really kind of unpick in terms of how, and again, one of Saskia's key points in her book, Saskia and Catherine's key points, is how do we provide differentiated assistance? You know, often and often we're providing kind of one-size-fits-all assistance, even though into one country, even though we know that different groups within that need different pieces. So that business about differentiated assistance has to become much more part of our everyday discourse. So I would say we understand the digital age actually has all of us involved in it, and we need to address those issues through differentiated assistance and solutions.
Final word to you, Saskia.
Yeah, just adding on to Sandra's point, I think what your question speaks to me, is recognizing diversity among women, right, as really central, and diversity among men. So rather than thinking, okay, we need women in political leadership, it's also about we need diverse women and diverse men in political leadership, and that includes age. Because what we're seeing in so many societies, politics is not just dominated by men, it's also dominated by old men, for example. Yeah. So there's a gap in... There's a gap there. But then also what we're seeing, gender norms between young men and young women are really different, where a lot of young men are much more conservative than young women are in our own society in the United States, but also in Europe, in South Korea, and many other places. So that tells us age is a really important variable here. So whenever we're talking about engaging on women's political leadership, thinking about what's happening with the older generation and the younger generation and attitudes among young men and women, so that in 30 years we don't have kind of the same problems we have now because we haven't actually addressed these norms among the new generation.
Wonderful. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for these inspiring reflections. And we are now honored to call to the stage Ambassador Geeta Rao Gupta, the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues at the State Department, who will provide closing remarks for today's event.
Thank you so much, Jamila, and another round of applause for the fabulous panelists. I truly enjoyed listening to the conversation and the many points that you made. My remarks have all kinds of scribbles all over them because of that. It's truly an honor to be with all of you, current members, but also I hope future members of the Women Lead community of practice, to close out this exciting launch event. As we head into the 75th NATO summit, it's encouraging to see so many partners across various sectors. Of course, our colleagues from the US government and USAID, Department of State, representatives from our NATO allies and partners, and members of civil society. A big thank you to Carnegie and NDI for hosting this event. It's wonderful to see that we're all together gathered here in defense of women's political participation as essential to peace, democracy, and security. And I use the word defense deliberately because, as we've discussed today, women's political and civic participation is under direct attack. As many have said, it's an attack on multiple fronts. Long-standing barriers to women's civic and political participation and leadership, including lack of access to political networks and resources and gender-based violence, continue to undermine women's inclusion in democratic processes. And on top of that, as we've heard, in today's digital world, women political and public figures, particularly those in conflict and crisis-affected contexts and from marginalized groups, are increasingly facing new threats, like the one we just talked about, technology-facilitated gender-based violence, and the manipulation of information. This is only amplified by the rise in direct, well-financed, and coordinated attacks on women and girls' rights and freedoms across the globe. It's not just individuals, it's countries, it's groups, and it's a strange group of malign actors who've come together to use gender equality as the tip of the spear to undermine democracy. And I think it's important to keep that in mind because this effort should be much, much broader than those of us who are interested just in promoting gender equality. The impacts of online misogyny and violence are having a chilling effect on women's and girls' civic and political participation. And we're seeing the consequences play out across the global landscape in which the progress achieved in recent decades by the global gender equality movement has in fact stagnated and is beginning to go backwards. And there are numbers to prove this. Many have cited them today. I won't repeat them. And you can feel that those low numbers, in striking contrast to those low numbers of women in political participation, 85% of women witness or experience online violence. That's a statistic that I'm horrified by. And during my travels over the past year, I've seen the faces behind those numbers in women throughout the world, in many corners of the globe, from Iceland to Kenya to Colombia, in a broad range of careers in political and public life. And I've seen the real-life consequences of that. A Kenyan journalist told me, I would never recommend this career to a younger person. It's far too dangerous. That sent a chill down my spine, I'll tell you. It's becoming harder and harder to believe that the future is female. The daily battle for women in political office is becoming too much. As a former woman prime minister put it, women simply don't have enough gas left in the tank. And this is not an individual threat, it is how democracies atrophy. Unless we combine the forces of our energy and resources together to support women's political participation through a different sort of collective defense, to quote the NATO Charter, collective defense for the preservation of peace and security. That's why I'm excited to join my US government colleagues and members of the Network for Gender Inclusive Democracy today to launch this Women Lead initiative. We know that women's engagement in decision-making institutions results in more equal, just, and secure societies. Indeed, we simply cannot achieve a peaceful, secure, and democratic global future unless we protect and increase investments in women's political leadership. And Women Lead will do just that, marshalling existing programs and leveraging new commitments in defense of gender equity and equality and of democracy and international peace, getting us the resources that you said we need, Saskia. So we look forward to growing our community of practice to include new members from the government, private, nonprofit, and philanthropic sectors who will contribute, we hope, their own resources and collaborate in support of the flagship US government programs that were mentioned today. Programs like my office's She Wins initiative, which advances the leadership of local women-led civil society organizations to address peace and security challenges in their communities, which includes a rapid response fund to provide agile, easy-to-access funds that directly support local women-led organizations at the onset of a crisis. And the effort that Director Klein mentioned, the Department of State's efforts to prioritize, understand, prevent, and address technology-facilitated gender-based violence through the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse, which now brings together 15 countries. I'm proud to announce that we just welcomed Finland to the Global Partnership as part of their commitment to Women Lead. And we also have a multi-stakeholder advisory group for the partnership. Throughout the course of our work with the Global Partnership, we have consistently heard from survivors of online harassment and abuse about their need for immediate support. That is why I'm excited to share that my office is currently in the process of awarding a new innovative project that will rapidly provide emergency support to women politicians, political candidates, and civil society leaders who have experienced extreme forms or threats of technology-facilitated gender-based violence globally. Because although it is institutions that commit the atrocities, it is individual women who suffer the consequences. So we look forward to sharing more of this project in the coming months. And as we conclude today's event and dive into the NATO summit activities, let us hold on to the conviction that the future can be female and will be female, and commit to working together through Women Lead, through NATO and beyond, to supply the fuel to fill up our tanks, the tanks of women leaders, to keep their engines running on the long road ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for joining us.
Yep.